This is Written in Bone, Chapter 3, Part 2. The historical evidence uncovered so far supports this theory. Catherine Coral Walls volunteers as a historian for the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities. One of her goals is to identify J.R. 1225b by researching the historical record. At least 4 boys were known to have been on the 3 ships that arrived in Jamestown in 1607 and were therefore likely candidates. Reading journals, church records, and many other materials, Coral Walls meticulously traced leads for each name. 2 of the boys are mentioned as being alive in journal accounts in 1608, so they clearly hadn't died in 1607. According to records found in England, the 3rd boy would have been 9 years old. That year, too young to be a J.R. 1225b. The last, and Coral Walls believes most likely candidate, is a young man named Richard Mutton. Richard Mutton is listed by John Smith as one of the boys that arrived in Virginia in May of 1607. His name does not appear again in the records, she explained. We've not determined the exact birthplace or birth date for Richard, but I've located one possibility in a baptism record for 2nd of June 1593 in London, England. Richard Mutton certainly seems a fitting candidate for J.R. 1225b. His disappearance from the historical record suggests he may have died in 1607. If Coral Walls has correctly located his birth record, he was 14 years old at the time of his death, well within Doug Owsley's age estimate for J.R. 1225b. Still, as tantalizing as the possibility seems, J.R. 1225b may not be Richard Mutton. Many colonists who traveled to Jamestown were not listed in the historical record, so the skeleton could belong to an unnamed boy. Only further research will determine whether the identification can be confirmed. So here is a map of southern England. Okay, they believe that based off of his carbon-13, the lack of corn in his diet, that he came from England, and they also believe he could be a person named Richard Mutton, which is so interesting that they think they found this. Okay, Written in Bone, Chapter 4, The Captain. The teenage boy who may have been Richard Mutton is one among many fascinating life stories that archaeologists and forensic anthropologists have rescued from the buried past of the colonial Chesapeake area. A different grave found in Jamestown a few years before J.R. 1225b posed a set of puzzles and possible solutions no less compelling. The discovery began with a trash pit that William Kelso's team of archaeologists unearthed in 2002 as they excavated alongside what had been the western wall of Jamesport. Within the pit, settlers had buried typical 17th century colonial trash, pieces of tobacco pipes, bricks, and oyster shells. Because these artifacts dated approximately to the 1630s, the team knew that anything beneath the trash pit would have to belong to an earlier time period. To their surprise, what they found as they continued the dig was the telltale soil stain of a grave shaft. Most graves and graveyards are treated with respect. People wouldn't customarily bury trash above a grave unless the presence of the grave had been forgotten. Let's scroll back up. So here is archaeologist Tonya Dietz' rock carefully brushes away soil from the skull of the remains buried outside the James Fort walls. And in this picture, a long staff, right here, was buried with the remains. The iron tip was heavily encrusted with rust, and the colored pole next to the staff is a measuring tool. So here's the staff right here, and then here's the measuring tool. 2 other interesting facts stood out. Unlike other graves found during the excavation of the fort, this grave was outside the fort, not within it. And because the grave lay parallel to the fort's wall, the team knew that the wall must have already been standing at the time the shaft was dug. As Kelso's team excavated the grave shaft, they screened the backfill soil that had been used to fill it centuries before. They found no colonial artifacts in the soil. In the earliest graves, we found nothing but prehistoric materials, Kelso explained. Historians and archaeologists use the term prehistoric to refer to the time before written history. The lack of colonial artifacts in the backfill didn't mean that the grave was dug before the colonists came to Jamestown, though. But because it lay parallel to the fort wall, it must have been dug after the fort was built. As Kelso described, the contents of the backfill simply meant that the grave is from a period where there isn't enough historical material around to accidentally end up in the shaft. Together with the materials in the trash pit and the presence of the fort wall, the backfill helped the team date the grave to 1607 to 1608. The shape of the burial itself indicated that the remains had been enclosed in a coffin, a rare privilege for Chesapeake colonists early in the 17th century. Because building a coffin required time, energy, and wood that could all be used in other ways, most individuals were buried in shrouds only. Remember, a shroud is the cloth that they wrap around the person's remains to keep their limbs together. The use of a coffin suggested that this grave contained the remains of a person of some importance. When the archaeologists excavated down to the level where the coffin lid would have been, they made another unusual discovery. A rust-colored soil stain was outside the coffin. The stain, which was near the end of the coffin that contained the upper part of the body, narrowed suddenly and continued for about 5.5 feet. We didn't really know what it was, Kelso recalled. The rust in the soil suggested the presence of an object made of iron, and indeed, close examination suggested that there appeared to be some sort of artifact encased in the rust. The artifact was very fragile, so it was excavated as a block, with the surrounding soil still firmly around it. The block was taken to a laboratory to be x-rayed to attempt to identify the artifact's shape before the soil was removed. The X-ray revealed an object that the archaeologists had seen in drawings from the 17th century, the iron pike or point of a captain's leading staff, a lance-like weapon used by persons of high rank in the military. The pike fit on a long wooden pole called a shaft. In the grave, the long, thin soil stain that extended away from the rust-encrusted iron pike was the only remaining evidence of the staff's wooden shaft. While the leading staff could have been used in combat, it's also possible that it was carried as a ceremonial weapon. A weapon like this one would have been placed in a grave only as a sign of respect and honor for the revered person. Kelso recalled, for example, that some of the courtiers who served Queen Elizabeth I of England had placed their own leading staffs in her grave as a sign of respect. As the archaeologists continued their work, they were delighted to discover that the skeleton in the grave was very well preserved. The remains were given the official identification number of Ch.3 1046B, but the leading staff prompted the team to dub the skeleton the Captain. Other than a few missing foot bones, the skeleton was complete. As Kelso described it, on a scale of 1 to 10, the Captain is a 10. Given the poorly preserved state of other Jamestown skeletons, such as Ch.R. 1225B, why were the Captain's bones in such excellent condition? So before removing the staff, it was x-rayed here, and you can see the shape, and then the conservators cleaned it to reveal its real shape. Now remember, this is the iron point, but the wooden part of the staff had disappeared over time. So shroud pins are used to hold a burial shroud in place. When they're made of copper, the pins leave behind a green stain after they've corroded. So, ooh, look at that green stain. After all, the Captain's bones, like the others in Jamestown, had undergone a destructive alternating cycle of wet and dry conditions. His wooden coffin would have quickly deteriorated, offering no long-term protection for the bones. The answer, as in so many archaeological puzzles, is the soil. The area where the Captain was buried has sandy soil with a very different consistency than the clay-filled soil that surrounded the graves of Ch.R. 1225B and other colonists buried within James Fort. Water easily drains from sand, and so the soil didn't remain wet for long, even after the heavy rains. Because the Captain's bones hadn't laid in swampy underground puddles as the others had, they were better preserved. So remember, Ch.R. 1225B, that subsoil he was buried in was clay, and it traps that moisture, and so it deteriorates the skeletal remains much quicker, but because the captain was buried in a sandy soil, it didn't keep that moisture, so it preserved him better. This preservation helped the team readily glean useful information from the bones. For example, while Ch.3's grave and remains had required considerable analysis to determine how he was buried, Kelso immediately felt certain that the captain was definitely shrouded. Not only were his knees and leg bones positioned close together, but the bones from his right forearm had green stains, an unmistakable sign of decomposing shroud pins. Shroud pins, or straight pins, like those used in sewing clothes, were used to hold together parts of a shroud. Most evidence of such pins is found around the skull. That's because when a body was shrouded, the face was often left exposed so that family members and friends could see the individual's face as they paid their last respect. Shortly before burial, a separate piece of cloth was placed over the face and pinned in place. Well-preserved shroud pins may look as good as new, but such preservation of colonial shroud pins, which were usually made of copper, is rare. When buried in soil over a period of centuries, copper undergoes chemical reactions that cause it to corrode, or decay. Corroded copper forms a substance called copper oxide, which leaves a green discoloration. Poorly preserved copper pins may only remain as a small green fleck or a stain on a bone or in the soil. Doug Owsley's forensic examination of the captain revealed more. The pelvic bones helped confirm the skeleton belonged to a male. Bony spurs called lipping had formed on the man's spine and right arm. Lipping is a sign of arthritis, a painful disease that often affects the joints of older people. The lipping on the captain's bones was minimal, suggesting that he had just a touch of arthritis. That, plus the fused epiphysis on his long bones, indicated he was between 33 and 39 years old when he died. Features on the skull suggested he had a large, broad nose and a small, square chin. Based on the length of his leg bones, he'd been about 5 feet 3 inches. That is tall. The overall size of his bones indicated he'd been a slender rather than a stocky man. Thanks to another principle of forensic anthropology, Owsley was able to assess the captain's level of physical activity during his lifetime. No matter how active people are, bones appear slightly thicker in the places where muscles attach to them. When a person uses the same muscles frequently over time, however, that labor is reflected by further changes in the bones. One way a body responds to a muscle being heavily used is by building more bone mass in that area, Owsley explained. The areas where heavily used muscles are attached to bone become even more developed and defined as a result. Owsley noted that the places where the captain's arm muscles had been attached to the bones were slightly more developed on the right humerus, the upper arm bone, than those on the left. Still, none of the areas were as hugely developed as they would be in a person who had lived a life filled with hard labor. Observing the lower right arm bones, the ulna and radius were slightly longer than the left ones, Owsley concluded that the captain had used his right arm more than the left. While never a hard laborer, he'd been a physically active right-handed man. During the examination of the skull, Owsley noticed that the captain was missing a few teeth. Had the teeth fallen out after the captain was buried? Teeth often do. Or before his death? In the 17th and 18th centuries, tooth loss was a common occurrence. By the time people reached their late 20s or 30s, they were likely to have already lost one tooth, if not more, as a result of decay. When Owsley took a closer look at the empty tooth sockets, he saw that new bone growth had started to fill the sockets. Bone grows only while a person is alive, so the captain must have lost the teeth long enough before his death for new bone growth to occur. The captain's remaining teeth showed moderate signs of wear and had a few small cavities. As Owsley continued to examine the skull, he saw extra bone formations on the bones inside the opening where the captain's nose had been. These kinds of changes are the result of chronic or ongoing infections that cause the tissue inside the nasal area to become infected. The examination may have made the captain sound stuffed up, as if he had a cold when he talked. His left ankle had small fractures, likely the result of